So as our country is going through this kind of um, unparalleled um, explosion of coronavirus cases that we've been dealing with at this point for months, I thought it was time that we kind of revisit what we know and what we don't know. And we've got a small group here assembled to kind of talk through this and ask questions as we go. So just a little bit about me. My name is Michal Tal. I'm an instructor at Stanford University. I have been working on infectious diseases for over 15 years now. My primary research focus is on looking at how the immune system responds to different pathogens and how those immune responses can actually hurt us. And so I'll be talking about coronavirus in that context, but just also kind of trying to really describe what we know thus far, because our understanding of coronavirus has come an incredible way over these last few months. So basically, this virus that's making a lot of people very sick is very, very tiny. The name of the virus is SARS-CoV-2. The name of the disease is COVID-19. And what you can see is that there's some very critical proteins that make this virus tick. So there's the spike protein on the outside, there's this nucleic capsid protein on the inside, and together with its membrane and envelope, that's really how it comes together. Now, you guys have been hearing a lot about antibodies, and the reason that antibodies are so important is that antibodies are your immune system's way of recognizing, tagging, even kind of neutralizing and deactivating these viral particles. And we can use these in diagnostics and therapeutics, and they are really, really critical also in research to help us get a better understanding of this virus. So one of the biggest questions that I get asked is, what does our return to normal look like? When is it going to happen? How are we going to get there? And I think that a lot of us are thinking about that at this point in late October, where we're heading into Thanksgiving in November and the holidays in December, and a lot of people are thinking, how am I going to see my family? Am I going to be able to travel? What is this looking like? Well, we are currently at this moment heading towards new heights solidly into our third wave. And so it definitely looks like we are headed into a very rough winter. If this continues and we don't take very significant measures in order to mitigate this. So if you look at the new cases per day, clearly when we were looking in April, there was terrible under-testing at this time point, and we weren't able to run enough tests. A lot of people went undiagnosed, but what you could see around the country is that a few peak areas were just really taking off, while most of the country was actually spared during this time. In our second peak, you saw that with a lot of complacency around the summertime, and people thought that they were going to be okay because it was warm out, but actually in reality, a lot of people where it was very hot were spending a lot of time indoors in the AC together, unmasked, and that really fueled our entrance into the second wave that we experienced over the summer. And now as we are in this third wave, what you can see is that the big problem that we're experiencing is that many, many, many different areas of the country are all going off at once. And this is going to very much complicate our response as we've been doing it up until now, because when it was fewer areas of the country, we were sending doctors from other parts of the country, we were sending equipment from other parts of the country. That's going to be more complicated as more and more of the country is actually affected at the same time. So this is just showing you by state the week of the highest daily positive cases. Now, this only went up to October 14th, so this is already old news, but you can see that, you know, October is absolutely showing us more and more states having their highest week. So if we look at, you know, there were so many comments during the second peak saying, oh, this is just, they're just doing more testing. So it just looks really bad because we're doing all this testing. So we're finding all these cases. But you can just look at hospitalizations and deaths in that case and see very clearly that that second peak wasn't just a matter of finding more cases. Yes, we were absolutely doing a better job of identifying cases in the second peak. And we were better able to accommodate more people coming in for hospitalizations. What you see that happened in the first peak is people were really only coming to the hospital once they were already at death's door. And at that point, there's very little that can be done. And so there was a very high mortality rate, much higher than one would have expected, which was well mitigated during the second peak. So during the second peak, what were some of those really key interventions that helped so much? Well, first of all, a lot of kind of intervention and containment protocols were better understood and better defined. So these involved proning, oxygen supplementation, antivirals, convalescent plasma, better personal protective equipment, so better masks and face shields and cleaning protocols. And along with that, two of the things that made the biggest difference were use of steroids for late disease and also blood thinners. So better understanding of these coagulation cascades that were going off and the clotting that was causing a lot of the disease. So not just thinking about this as just a pneumonia and infection in the lungs, but thinking about also the heart damage that was happening and the clotting that was happening. So those interventions led to very sharp reductions for in-hospital mortality, and also the fact that as cases were being identified and people were able to come to the hospital when they were sick before they were actually dying, there was a lot more that could be done. Now, as you can see, looking at where we are today, you can see that hospitalizations are starting to tick back up again, and at a delay from that, deaths are starting to tick back up again. And if you look, you know, here at where we are in terms of the daily deaths, you can see that in this second peak, we hovered beyond 1,000 deaths per day. And, you know, right now we're in the 700 somethings and heading back up in that wrong direction. So a lot of people ask, you know, how is this going to end? When is it going to end? I think that this was a really wonderful article that really, you know, talks about a lot of the components of this and how the most important point from here, I think, that I would want to get across is that this isn't going to end on one day. There's not going to be this one vaccine that comes out and now the pandemic is over. There's not going to be this one type of mask that comes out and now the pandemic is over. We're going to need to be very vigilant for a long time, and we're going to need to have multiple layers of protection in place in order to get this under control. And it's just going to slowly drift down to a point where we have it under control and it's not as much impacting our daily lives, but it's not that, you know, this coronavirus is going to just one day all of a sudden disappear. So I thought that this graphic was very helpful in terms of thinking about what are these kinds of mitigations and protection layers that we're going to need to utilize in order to return to some components of normalcy. And I think the biggest thing that we can do to try to get there is to try to stay away from these indoor gatherings together, these kinds of highest risk scenarios, and spend a lot more time outdoors. And I know that as a lot of the country is getting colder right now, that becomes more complicated, but our time outdoors and with masks and with really good ventilation and people staying home as often as they can, these are going to be really important components to keeping everything in check. So we are heading into flu season, and I know a lot of you guys are thinking about this and hearing how important it is this year to get your flu shots. And the thing that I wanted to bring up is that what we are facing right now in this moment, as cases are peaking again into this third peak, is that we have two options. We can go into a double pandemic where we need to simultaneously deal with COVID-19 across the country as well as flu, which we battle every year and has a disastrous toll in and of itself. Or we can follow the model of many other countries around the globe who have managed to keep their pandemic under control. And by doing so, the measures that they've been taking to keep coronavirus under control, the masks, the distancing, the ventilation, the staying outdoors, the testing, the watching for symptoms, that has almost entirely quenched flu across the globe. So what we always have is we can always look to the Southern Hemisphere as they come out of their winter and their flu season and look at what their flu season was like, and that often can tell us a lot about what our flu season is going to look like. I hope that that's the case, because the Southern Hemisphere this year did an incredible job at controlling SARS-CoV-2 and at controlling flu. And if you look in the black lines compared to years previous, which are for temperate South America shown in this yellowish green, or for if you look at Australia, New Zealand, so Oceania, you can see their flu lines are in blue. And this year is shown in black. And you can also see how sharply our flu season ended this year compared to years past in March, when we were first isolating and taking SARS-CoV-2 very seriously. So what I'm very hopeful for is that we'll be looking at a flu season like this, that we completely quench all spread of flu for the year by everybody being very vigilant about getting vaccinated and everybody taking all these other non-pharmaceutical interventions that we're using in order to protect ourselves from coronavirus, to also protect ourselves from flu. But unfortunately, if we don't do this, if we are cavalier about coronavirus, we will unfortunately also be giving flu every opportunity that it needs to spread. And when combined together, these infections could not only cause a major additional burden for the hospitals, but also for people who are co-infected. This does not bode well for a good outcome. So the next big thing that people wonder about is who gets sick with COVID? Do kids not get sick? Do we catch COVID from our groceries? Do we catch COVID from other people? What do we need to worry about? What tools do we have in our toolbox? And which are these factors that are impacting how sick a particular person gets? So as each person is worried about their own risk factors, how can they look to that? So I think one of the major areas of progress that we've had over these last few months is our understanding of transmission of coronavirus, and so specifically of this SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus. So at the beginning, we were very focused on what we call fomite transmission, which is transmission from surfaces. This is a major component of spread for other cold-causing viruses, which is why there was so much emphasis on this at the beginning. So one of the best tools we have in our arsenal for protecting from normal seasonal colds is if everybody is very vigilant about washing their hands, washing surfaces. But of course, this SARS-CoV-2 is a respiratory virus. And what we've found is that while it is found in these droplets, and some of them are heavier droplets, some of them are also these very light droplets that kind of hang for longer periods of time. So there's no magic, 6 feet apart and you're fine. These particles can linger. These particles are essentially going from one person's breath right into another's. And so we need multiple containment strategies. We need masks and distance and good ventilation in order to really quench this, because what we're finding is that especially within environments that are being kept clean, the absolute primary route of spread of SARS-CoV-2 is actually through respiratory transmission, so these aerosols and droplets. And so while so many people have been kind of hyper-focused on washing all of their groceries off and everything that they encounter, and clearly it is always very important to wash your hands, and it's also important for SARS-CoV-2. SARS-CoV-2 can stay viable on your hands for several hours. However, the main route of transmission and the way that most people have gotten sick and the primary route of spread is through respiration. So as we start thinking about how small SARS-CoV-2 is compared to, for example, a particle of dust, right? So if you look at this scale bar right here, you can see this is 100 nanometers. Dust particles, of course, vary in size, but they're a few orders of magnitude larger than that. This is 100 nanometers here on this scale bar, looking at the SARS-CoV-2 virion. So it's this very tiny little thing, and it can range in terms of what size droplet it's in. But even as you look in the light, that you can see dust particles, which are quite heavy, hovering in the air for quite some time. When a room, especially when a room is stuffy and not properly ventilated. So this is just an image of 2 people breathing, and one is wearing a mask and one is not. And it's very clear just from watching their breath and how far it's getting and the primary spread of these particles, that just by wearing a mask you can already tremendously reduce how many of the particles from you are coming out directly to others that are nearby.
Mickey, do we have a good sense of how many particles it takes for one person to exchange with another before that second person gets sick?
We don't. And it's something that people are actively looking into. The problem that we come into, there's 2 factors. There's 2 things that we have to know in order to know that. So one is that we need a really good measure of infective dose. And currently we're using cell culture for that. So we're just taking cells in a dish and exposing them to the virus. And these cells that have ACE2 that can get infected, we're seeing how infected they get. And that's one way for us to say, oh, if we collected virus from the surface, is it capable of causing infection? Or if we collected virus from the air, is it capable of causing infection? And we'll use cells in culture to tell us that. The thing is, though, that that's just a proxy, right? And so that's giving us a measure of infectivity, but it doesn't tell us in our lungs, in these humidity conditions, at this temperature, in this size body, at this distance from that person, with what is the minimum infectious dose. And so we don't know that. One thing that we do know at this point fairly clearly is that infectious dose matters. And that's why even healthy doctors were getting very, very sick, because they were getting exposed to these very high doses. So if you got a very high infective dose, that was much more likely to make you sick in a person who would have otherwise maybe had a milder case and recovered. So we know that infectious dose matters, but we don't know the minimum infectious dose to get you infected.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what this graph is showing you is by state, what percentage of people were wearing masks most or all of the time in public, and how many new cases they had per 100,000 people over the last 7-day average, and this was done on October 7th, so that first week in October. And what you can see is that there was a not surprising, very tight correlation between mask usage, percentage-wise, in a state, and the number of cases. And of course, you can say this is correlated to so many things because they're probably not just wearing masks, they're probably distancing and taking other precautions. And absolutely, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, there's a lot of different layers that we can use to protect ourselves. But one major point that I want to take away from this is that doing those things is helping, and wearing masks is correlated with a state that's doing much, much better. And so as we're looking at most certainly being in this situation for the near future, the next few months for sure, one of the things that I would really recommend is that everybody find a mask type that's comfortable for them, that does not slide under their nose, that they don't have to mess with it all the time, and get a bunch. Because the thing about reusable masks, so we're a culture that's used to using disposable masks or N95s, which I wish we had enough N95s for everybody. We don't. There are some very good KN95s available that you can find for purchase, or other disposable surgical masks. If you are using masks that you make or purchase that can be reused, it's really important that that mask be dry. So if you let a mask get moist and you keep wearing it, there are other things other than SARS-CoV-2 that you could catch from that. And so it's really not ideal to just keep a very moist, humid environment around your face. And so ideally, you would want to have a whole bunch of masks so that as a mask gets moist, you can just switch it out, wear a new one, have plenty to wash and wear. And if you're going to use disposable masks, have enough that you can change them out. So get comfortable wearing masks. It's going to be one of the key ways that we can really try to stem control and save many, many lives. So the current estimate is that if we all start wearing masks right now, we could save 150,000 lives over the course of this winter. So just that one thing would have a huge impact. Now, a lot of people point out that each of the different things that we're trying to do is not perfect. None of them are perfect. Wearing masks alone isn't perfect. You saw in that visualization, even the person wearing the mask, there was still some air coming out this way, and that way there was still a little bit coming out this way. Physical distance, I've already told you, isn't perfect. So 6 feet, there's no magic number there that's going to for sure protect you. Ventilation by itself isn't perfect. The air is still going through some path that's still, you're still maybe going to be in its way. Masks, hand hygiene alone, definitely not perfect. You saw from the White House cluster that fast testing isn't perfect. Now that testing was not sensitive enough to be used the way that it was being used in order to test asymptomatics. But that aside, you saw that just doing testing alone without taking other measures, that wasn't enough. Contact tracing by itself isn't enough. Surface cleaning isn't enough. But if you imagine this like a Swiss cheese model and take into account that each of these single layers of protection has its faults, when you pile them all up together, it's very hard for this virus to get through. And so you can really have, not 100% protection, but you can really get to something approaching something that feels like safety when you pile all of these different things on top of each other at the same time. And so that brings us to the tools in our toolbox. And this is really using physical distance from each other. Unfortunately, I know that this is very, very hard. But that's a really important tool that we have, and masks and efficient ventilation and contact tracing and doing everything outdoors that we can. And if we can combine that with getting rapid testing online and vaccination, and ideally therapeutics once we have them. But to prevent spread, these are the things that we could use to prevent even catching it in the first place. And so what we really need to get moving on and to implement on a larger basis is this rapid testing and vaccination. That would really, really beef up our toolbox. So I just wanted to kind of end off that segment by reviewing that if you want to look more into this, there's a lot of really good information out there about fomite transmission versus airborne transmission, and there's a lot of really good guidance out there now about what's understood about this, and really revisiting, if we're trying to stay in any indoor space together, what the requirements of ventilation will be like for that space to try to make it safer. Okay, so now we understand that airborne transmission is very important, and we're trying to understand who is contagious, who are these super spreaders that we're hearing about, and how does SARS-CoV-2 spread? And in order to think about that, you've probably heard a lot about this number R naught. And, you know, are we at R naught 1, or are we above that? Where when you're at R naught 1, that means that one infected person, on average, spreads this virus to one other person. That means the rate stays steady. So you're not in some kind of crazy growth of the pandemic. As soon as R naught goes above 1, you have spread, and you have increased in number of cases, and the cases are growing. And that becomes a huge problem because that can take off very quickly. However, R naught really doesn't get across a very important nuance that we have in this particular pandemic, which is actually better described by a different variable that we call K. But I just want you to think about it as a dispersion factor. So while we say, you know, R naught is how many people on average will an infected person infect, the reality is that most people don't infect anybody. And a few people infect a ton of other people. And you'll see that the countries that have been most successful at really keeping this at bay have really focused on these cluster cases and scenarios that allow that kind of explosive spread. Because just keeping those at bay can really minimize most of the spread. And so in order to understand this, if you think about a low K, that actually means huge dispersion. So at a low K, that's when you've got super spreading. At a higher K, this is where, you know, one person maybe infects one or two other people. And so there's some really beautiful work that's come out of countries that are very carefully tracking and tracing their cases and testing everybody, and have made huge strides in how we understand transmission. And from this work, what I wanted to highlight is that they showed this very nice kind of 80-20 rule, where basically 20% of the people are responsible for 80% of the infections. And 70% of people actually don't infect anybody else at all. And so if you look at how super spreading works, what matters is not just, are you infectious, how infectious are you, and what kind of dispersion are you capable of at that time. So if you are extremely contagious on this day, let's say you're at you're on your first day of symptoms, you're super, super contagious, you're about as contagious as you're going to be, and you stay home, and you see nobody during that day, despite the fact that you were extremely contagious, you didn't infect anybody else. This plays into your dispersion factor. Now, if on that day, let's say it was the day before that, you were the day before you got your symptoms, you were almost as contagious as you could possibly be on that day. But let's say you went to a bar and you sat really close to other people and you had to yell a little bit because the music was high and you weren't wearing a mask. Well, there's a potential you may have infected a good portion of the people who were around you. So despite being similarly contagious, your actions during that day have this huge impact in terms of transmission. And what I think we all need to remember on days when it's not convenient to wear a mask or we want to be indoors with other people is to think about, if I got symptoms tomorrow, or if I tested positive tomorrow, and I look back on what I did today, would I be able to live with my actions? Would I be okay with the choices that I made today? And I think that if we always remember that question, then I think we can really, then we can keep to actions that we are going to feel okay with. And I think that many of us for months have been acting in this way and trying to be as careful as we can be with the information that we have. And I just want to say that doing those things has saved lives. By doing that, I know it's had a huge cost, but you have absolutely saved people by not getting infected and by not infecting others if you did get infected. So this is a recent example that came out of Vietnam, where they analyzed these cases from March. And what happened here was a super spreading event at a bar, where many of the super spreading events happen. And because, as we mentioned, the loud talking, close contact, no masks. And what happened is that this person, so case number 1 infected all of these different cases that you are then seeing in red or in blue. What you see, whether they were red, so symptomatic, or blue, asymptomatic, most of these people never went on to infect anybody else. A couple people infected one other household contact, same here. Now, then you have this workplace contact. So this person got infected. They infected somebody else in their workplace, who infected somebody else in their household, somebody else who shared a car, somebody else who worked with them. So, so this is where we can really very clearly see there was that original case in the bar. They infected a whole bunch of people. Most of them never went on to infect anybody else. One of them went on to infect a bunch of other people. And so what we really need to be very careful about are these interactions where we're putting multiple people at risk. And we can go beyond spreading to nobody or just one other person.
Mickey, in that last slide, was that P19 person reinfecting the P5 person, or is that a ambiguity?
They're not sure. So this additional person worked with both P5 and P14. And so they are actually not sure if P5 or P14 infected P19.
Okay, but it's not showing that P5 got reinfected by P19?
No, it's going this way.
Okay.
So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about reinfection. It does happen, but it's very rare, and it doesn't usually happen that quickly within a particular outbreak. Okay, so many of us have heard this statement before: what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? Let's just get this over with. Let it rip, like let's get this. Most people are gonna have a mild or even asymptomatic case, and then we're gonna be protected and we're gonna be fine, and we'll just get done with this. Unfortunately, this is very wrong, and it's wrong in many ways, and we're gonna talk about that. So one of the things that's wrong about that is that we really don't understand and won't understand for many years all of the ramifications of these mild or even asymptomatic infections. We already know that some of these people in the prime of their fitness, young, healthy adults, are having heart damage, are having, very, very devastating reactions to this infection. And so that in and of itself tells us that it's really not a safe strategy to just let this go. That's a crisis, not a plan. And I wanted to show you this picture because this particular patient suggested that it should be posted and people should see what this looks like. I wanted to make the point that a lot of young adults think, oh, this is something that's happening to the elderly. I don't have diabetes. I'm in the prime of my life. I'm going to be fine. The problem is that 21% of those aged 18 to 35 years still required intensive care. And I just wanted to hit home for you what intensive care looks like. This isn't something that you you know, a 1 in 5 chance of ending up in a hospital bed hooked up to this many machines, that's not something to be very cavalier about. And so I also wanted to make the point that not all of these young people are having just a mild infection and bouncing right back. The other thing that we really have to be concerned about, and we have to factor in, we spend so much time talking about these death rates or even the hospitalization rates, but then we don't talk about the recovery and how long the recovery is going to take and when you're going to come back to yourself. And I want to point out that there's this group of people that are being called long haulers. And these are people who weeks or even months after their first symptoms still have symptoms. And we're at the point where we're talking about 35% of people still having symptoms 3 weeks post-infection. So when you're thinking of a flu that you've had and, you know, it knocks you out, but you bounce back and you were yourself after that, this isn't that. And I want to show you what this looks like. So these long haulers, I think this line is perfect. Surviving may not mean thriving. These symptoms are not, you know, I think what any of us are looking for in terms of, oh, you know, don't worry about it. Worst case, you're going to be looking at extreme fatigue, loss of cognitive function, loss of ability to exercise, even after you survived it. These are survivors, you know, and so this is something that I think really has to get factored in, and it's displayed here in this graph. So here they showed that in a young, low-risk population with ongoing symptoms, almost 70% of individuals had impairment in one or more organs 4 months after their initial symptoms of SARS-CoV-2 infection. So for these long haulers, which are not a small fraction of the young people who've been infected, this is devastating. And so I want to make sure that we don't just focus on the death statistics, because surviving it doesn't necessarily make you stronger. So if I want to understand if I'm in a high risk category, what can I expect? How can I predict how my body's going to respond? Well, what we've known for a while is that there is a huge age factor here. In terms of, again, we're back to death rate because that's what so many of the statistics are on. And that's something, you know, that's the absolute most severe outcome that we can have. And if you look in this over 80 age group, you can see that they're absolutely having the highest case fatality rate. We also know that cardiovascular diseases and diabetes, respiratory disease, hypertension, these all significantly predispose you to disease and specifically to death. And also male versus female also increases the risk. And then you can see this broken down in terms of discharged, remain in the hospital, died, with comorbidities or without comorbidities, split by male and female and by age range. So what I wanted to talk about, which becomes very important in terms of thinking, when do we test? When do we isolate? When do we intervene with this therapeutic versus another therapeutic? Is that it's really important to understand the kind of timeline of what's going on with our viral load versus what's going on with our immune response. And so if we think about it like this, from that moment that we're first exposed, it takes a little while for the virus to grow up and for you to grow within your body and to reach a point at which you could actually be contagious. So that's going to take a little bit of time. And then on top of that, you're not going to stay at that peak infectivity, you know, for a particularly prolonged amount of time. That's, in most cases, you know, within a matter of days, you're already going to be coming back down and being significantly less infectious as you go towards these later time points in your infection. Now, what I want to really point out is that in this particular infection, we have both the problem of asymptomatics who never develop symptoms, And also the fact that most of the infectious period is actually before you started symptoms, or briefly after you started symptoms, but often people are most infectious actually the 3 days before starting symptoms and then the 3 days after, at which point you now become significantly less infectious. This is a huge point on a few reasons. One is that one of the most devastating things about this pandemic is that so many people died alone. They could not have visitors with them in the hospital weeks after starting symptoms. And part of that was because we just didn't have the personal protective equipment to allow other people into the hospital to either expose other patients or themselves get exposed. But a lot of that was because we didn't really understand the infectious window and when people were contagious and when they weren't. And what I would argue that we need the most desperately, now that we have a better understanding of the infectivity time window, is that we really need good tests that tell us when we are and when we aren't contagious, when we're in this window at which we could really infect other people. Because as we get beyond these time points, as we get into the 30 days post-infection, if we're not allowing people to say goodbye, we really need to be able to, we need to revisit that in terms of with actual justification of understanding who is contagious and when. The other thing is that this comes back to that point of often that day that you start symptoms, you have to think back to what you did in the last 3 to 5 days and who you may have exposed when you didn't realize that you were infected. And that's why it kind of requires this vigilance from us of always, staying really, really careful about always acting as if we might be contagious because we know only at a delay and only if we develop symptoms. Now, those symptoms as they develop, one of the most common symptoms that's coming up is this loss of smell or taste, body aches, cough, fever. Now, body aches, cough, and fever, that's going to be shared by flu. And so as we start coming into flu season, one of the things that's going to get really tough is that symptomatically there's a lot of overlap between these infections, and it's going to be a little trickier to tell them apart. Now, in a severe infection, here's what we're still trying to understand better, as opposed to, because in severe infection, it's a little bit longer that we can detect viral load, that we can still detect that there's some virus present. But this comes back to Ben's question from earlier about, what's this dose that's required to infect another person or to get infected? And if the cutoff is here, if you've got to be this high with your viral load in order to infect somebody else, then at this point, you're no longer infectious. And so this is where, we really need better tests that allow us to understand at what point in time you're contagious versus not. And I think that this is the area that I'm most excited about, rapid tests, even lower sensitivity rapid tests. If all they can detect is this window when you're most contagious, that actually makes them incredibly valuable to us because they're telling you when you're contagious, which is actually a more important information than you need, than that you still have some virus in you that you haven't completely cleared out, if at that point you're no longer contagious. Now, severe symptoms, now we can see much more of this: high fever, severe cough, confusion, persistent chest pain, shortness of breath. These are symptoms that should definitely have you, going to the hospital and getting medical care. So I really liked the way that this was put together, looking at the duration of infectivity. And as I mentioned, what we think at this point is that the real peak viral load and infectivity happens about 3 days before symptom onset to 3 days after. And what we know is that the longest out that somebody has been able to culture infectious virus from a person who was not immunocompromised. So actually just yesterday or the day before, it actually came out that somebody who's been immunocompromised has actually had infectious virus shedding for a very long time. But in somebody with a functional immune response, day 20 is the farthest out that anybody's been able to culture virus. And so I think that this really does require us to reassess these rules of visitation in the hospital. Okay, so can we be protected from infection or from reinfection? Does reinfection happen? Will vaccination prevent infection? So to do this, this is a slide I almost always give in all my talks. As I said, I'm an immunologist. And so I really, this is the thing that I'm constantly thinking about is how our immune system detects pathogens, how it tries to kill these pathogens, prevent them from replicating. But in doing so, your immune system itself can cause disease. And the pathogen itself can also cause disease. But it comes really critical to understand which of these disease symptoms that you're seeing, these clinical manifestations, which of them are coming from the pathogen and which of them are coming from the immune system. And in SARS-CoV-2, this is extremely critical to understand in terms of looking at therapeutic interventions. And the reason is that this is your viral load, right? It's coming up, it's peaking, and it's coming back down. And as your innate immune system, so you have two branches of your immune system. You have the innate that's always ready to go and always on the lookout. And then you've got this adaptive response. So the innate immune response, as soon as it starts to detect this virus, it starts ramping up, trying to bring this down and kind of licensing this adaptive immune response to go at it. Now, if disease is being caused here, it may be caused by the innate immune response, and it may be caused directly by the virus. If disease is being caused out here, it's much more likely being caused by your adaptive immune response and not by virus. And so this means that, well, at this time, it would be very helpful to take an antiviral. At this time, it actually may be more effective to take a steroid, which can dampen your immune response. But at this point, the virus is already low, so you don't have to worry about the virus at this point. So it would be devastating to take a steroid here, and it would be unhelpful to take an antiviral here. So it's very important to know where somebody is in their disease and if the disease is being caused by the virus or by the immune system. And so this is how that impacts the timeline of treatment tactics in the clinic, where here we really want to focus on these antiviral treatments. So you've heard about things like remdesivir, which actually probably only works at a very limited window of time, versus treatments like steroids, which are much better if utilized at these later periods of time when it's the adaptive immune response, which is causing the damage.
Is that possibly why you have the mixed results in terms of if the antiviral treatments are helpful?
Absolutely. That's absolutely what we think is going on. And so it becomes very tricky. So many clinical trials are running right now. And often you see clinical trials being run on the exact same drug. But what we're trying to change up is the day of treatment and the period of treatment where it really matters. Are you trying this on somebody on their first day of symptoms or just as they tested positive? Or are you trying this very far out, only on severe cases, only if with ventilation, only if with oxygen supplementation, only if with this, that, or the other thing? And so there's probably a very specific window at which point remdesivir is effective, but it's a limited window. And in the larger trials that have come out, even though this actually is the first approved therapeutic for SARS-CoV-2 for COVID-19, what we know at this point is that it probably has a very limited window of effectivity. And so it's very particular in which cases it's going to be helpful, in which cases it's not. And so the other thing that we have to factor in as we look through for different therapeutics is that if you're trying to treat people in this window, as they just maybe first got symptoms or just got their test positive, you only want to, at this point, use therapeutics which have a very low chance of hurting you. So, not really cause very many side effects or dangerous side effects. Steroid treatments are, of course, a much bigger deal, but they're only being utilized at these later time points when it's already clear that you're in a bad state, and if we don't do anything, that's much more likely to hurt you than if we intervene with some steroids. And so there's always this balancing act in terms of how much will the therapeutic hurt you and how much are we willing to risk in terms of what is the chance that you'll just be fine if we do nothing versus what's the likelihood that we absolutely have to do something in order to help you recover. And so what we really need is to look at each of these therapies and these moments of intervention in terms of, how likely is it that this is due to the virus at this point, and how likely is it that this is due to a misresponding immune response in terms of the disease that we're looking at. Now, I mentioned you're probably hearing a lot about antibodies, and antibodies is something I think about a lot. So I really wanted to go into this a little bit and talk about how antibodies work and what we're looking for in this context. And I wanted to try an analogy here in order to make it really clear how we think about antibodies. And so antibodies are these proteins, and they have this site here where they can recognize different things, and they're on the lookout for anything that is not you. And when they find something that is not you, that is foreign, that has come into your body, they want to trigger an alert. So they're constantly looking for invaders. Now, what I want you to imagine is that SARS-CoV-2, this virus, has this key to get into your cells through this receptor ACE2. So the spike protein on SARS-CoV-2 is binding your cells through ACE2. I want you to think about this spike like a key, and that ACE2 is the lock on your apartment door. So if we think about this virus like a bandit, where its only goal is to get in. So it first wants to get in, and then it wants to have some fun in your apartment. We know that not all coronaviruses in the past have caused disease, and none of them have ever caused disease like this before. Even the first SARS-CoV-1, didn't spread exactly in the way that this SARS-CoV-2 is spreading. So while SARS-CoV-1 was most infectious while you were already in the hospital and not that likely to infect that many more people, SARS-CoV-2 infects you and still lets you walk around and infect other people. And so we know that a lot of other coronaviruses have spike proteins, but they didn't fit our ACE2 lock. So a lot of these seasonal coronaviruses, or there's other viruses, they have a slightly different spike. It gets in a slightly different way. It doesn't fit this particular lock. Now, if we think about our bandit, and it's got, this bat virus met pangolin and recombined just the perfect way, got the right key. It's now got the spike protein that can unlock our ACE2. It's coming in the door. What's going to happen in regards to your immune response is your immune response is going to recognize that something has got in, and it's going to start making antibodies. And these antibodies basically serve as alarm bells, and they can trigger different things to turn on. So one antibody that you might have been hearing about is one that we call IgA. So IgA is all over all of your mucosal surfaces. It's absolutely in your nose, your mouth. It's recognizing that something got in, and it's triggering these alarm bells. Now, beyond just IgA, there's actually different types of IgA. So we can get into these nuances between IgA 1 and 2, and for immunologists, that's really important. Now, a whole other type of antibody, and one that's really important as it's running through your blood and protecting your lungs and your heart and your kidney and your livers. This is an antibody like IgG, and we can think about this as now antibodies that are bringing in different effector functions that can really knock this bandit out or stop it in its tracks. So you can imagine we could bring in police, we could bring in the sheriff, FBI, SWAT, depends on how, how reactive we are going to get to this virus and how much we're going to pull all the stops to get rid of this bandit and get it out. But we have all of these different types of IgG, 1 through 4, that can, and then even within that, but so we have all these different types of, say, law enforcement that we could bring in, and we have all these different types of IgG that we could bring in. Now, we also have other antibodies, and we have some big antibodies that can directly do stuff and come in right away. These antibodies are called IgM, which you've probably been hearing about. And if we think about these as different layers of protection, you can think about IgM like putting bars on your door. So now, this bandit's not going to be able to get in. And we also have the antibodies that can trigger alarms, and we have the antibodies that can call in law enforcement. But if we do that all the time, constantly, and don't stop, there's going to be total chaos, right? And so there's this balance that the body has to strike between just low-level surveillance or ramping up all this protection, setting off all the alarms, but then coming back down to just low-level surveillance. And so when people got really worried, the antibodies are disappearing, the antibodies are going away, it's very normal in an immune response that you mount this huge expansion of antibody production against a particular virus, and then you bring it down. Because if you just kept producing antibodies at that peak level to every pathogen that you've ever seen, your blood would be glue. So it would not be able to flow, it would not be able to do anything. We can't sustain that. And so what we have to find is this happy balance where we have enough of these proteins that we can set off alarms when we see the pathogen come back, but not so much that it's interfering with our day-to-day functions of what we're usually using our blood for, or the different secreted antibodies in our nose and mouth. And so now we think about what a vaccine is going to do. And so a vaccine is basically a way to give you a head start and to show your immune system what it's looking for. And it's basically just this way to already skip ahead from that chaos and go straight to that just, low-level surveillance strategy. So all of the current front-runner coronavirus vaccines that are being tested are all this strategy that we call intramuscular vaccination. You'll notice these are the kinds of vaccines that you get vaccinated right into your arm, as opposed to getting, a spritz in your nose, or there's other strategies, but everything being tested right now is all going right into your arm. So bandit tries to come in, it's got the key, it sees that there's surveillance, this isn't going to work, it's very quickly going to set off the alarms. But as we start to think about how our antibodies work and the antibodies that we've got in the blood versus the antibodies that we're secreting, this is where that matters that I was telling you about, this IgA versus IgG, because you've got to think, are these vaccines just going to protect us in the blood? Or are they also going to protect us in the nose and mouth where we actually may be getting infected? So imagine that the bandit saw that you're protected in the blood, that you made these IgG antibodies. And so, but now it's trying to get in through the nose. And the question is, do you have any antibodies there? So you can imagine trying to get in the window through, as opposed to just going right into the door. Now, if you have IgA, you will have surveillance here and you will be protected. And so this is where this really matters. And can you put the bars on, and can you call in law enforcement? And again, when we're thinking about those levels, remember that you're going to make some, and then it's going to come back down because you can't sustain this kind of constant chaos. But what I want you to think about in this case is that what we are expecting is that this intramuscular vaccination, these first line coronavirus vaccines, we're expecting that they are going to trigger very good immune response surveillance in the lungs. So antibodies that circulate through your blood, this is going to be really great here. Normally, if we were trying to make you make good antibodies that you would protect you in your nose, we would usually use an intranasal vaccination, which is going to make you make really good secreted antibodies. So this is the scenario that we are currently afraid of with the front runner vaccines, that you will make good antibody responses in the lungs and not in the nose. And that means you could still get infected and you could still infect others. So what we're afraid is going to happen, and is one of the very likely scenarios, is that we will actually generate many more asymptomatics, where you actually still get infected, but you don't get any disease. But you could still transmit the infection. And so this is going to be especially important in the first group of people who are getting vaccinated. And this is why we all have to remember that the moment a vaccine comes out, that's not the end of the pandemic. It's probably actually going to take us to get to a second generation of vaccines, or get everybody vaccinated, for us to get to the point where we can really quench spread in the population. And so what does this mean for you if you're going to be in one of these first line of people that gets vaccinated? It means that even after you're vaccinated, you're still going to have to wear a mask. And you're still going to have to wear a mask because you could still be contagious. Even if you are not susceptible yourself to disease, you're still going to have to wear that mask in order to protect others. So,
can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So in this scenario, it's kind of a door window, different antibody type scenario. Where does convalescent plasma fit into this? I mean, does that act just at the blood level, or does that act, thought to act throughout the body?
Yeah. So this is a great question. So convalescent plasma is another one of these therapeutics which had a lot of promise. We were very excited about, but then we started to realize it's not always as good as we think. We started to realize some of the nuance in there is like this. One of the nuances is that people make a lot of really good antibodies and then it's coming down. So at what moment you grab somebody in their stage of recovery in order to use their convalescent plasma, that matters. And then some people make really great antibody responses that are very protective. Some people actually make bad antibody responses that could hurt you. And so getting those could actually be bad. And so it's kind of a mixed bag. And so when you just get convalescent plasma from somebody who's maybe now 4 months out post-infection, well, that may not be so great. And depending on the antibodies that you are making and how much that is saturating the amount that you're getting, that may or may not help. And so convalescent plasma here is very tricky, but if it works, then it's very helpful. But do remember that that's antibody that's getting injected into your blood. And so again, the purpose of that is to reduce disease in these people who are very, very severe. And part of what we think is going on there in the people who are really being helped by convalescent plasma is some of it actually is just a dilution factor of some people who are very severe making bad antibodies. And if you give them a nice dose of good antibodies, that could actually dilute out their bad antibodies and help them get some nice effectivity. But remember that at this point that we're trying most of the convalescent plasma, in most cases, of course not in the high profile cases that you've been hearing about in the last couple of weeks, but in most of the cases up until now, it's often getting tried very late, at which point there's actually not that much virus still left. It's more the immune response kind of going haywire. And so again, timing really matters there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Does that mean that most of the deaths are really caused by the immune system responding badly rather than the virus actually causing it?
So there's two components here. If you look at the autopsies, as unpleasant as that is, you see two major profiles. There are other things that can fail, but one profile is these ravaged lungs that are just not allowing air exchange anymore. And the other profile is this cardiovascular attack. So the clotting, the heart damage, those are the two kind of main profiles that you're seeing in the autopsies. Now, it's a little hard to say in the case of the lungs how much of that ravaging was done by the virus infecting these cells and then making a ton of virus and releasing itself and killing those cells in that process, and how much of it was the immune response to that causing this tremendous inflammation. But we do think that that is the bigger component. So, and the use of steroids being so effective at these later points when people are close to death is highly indicative of the fact that most of the damage is actually being caused by a misfiring immune response that has come unregulated and unhinged, and is actually, so your immune response has been entrusted with protecting you from foreign entities, and it sometimes takes it too far, and then it ends up hurting you or even killing you, which is not what it was supposed to do. And so that's why we call this a misfiring, when there's actually this, the immune system, your own immune system is attacking you from the inside.
And is that why the vaccines might be helpful, is because it's teaching the immune system to react in an appropriate way rather than...
Exactly. That's exactly right. So with a vaccine, we have the opportunity to train your immune system at the best possible antibody types that it could make. And then it has those ready, and it has those on surveillance, and then it's going to really give it a leg up. And so that's why it is much, much safer to try to, so everybody's talking about this herd immunity that we would need to reach in order to quench this. The safest way to get to herd immunity, the only way we've ever talked about getting to herd immunity before, is through vaccination, is through a safe campaign of training your immune system about what antibodies it needs to make. Because this virus is so dangerous, even in young, healthy adults, and we really don't understand for kids, we really don't understand the ramifications yet, and we're going to be probably investigating this over the next decade. But I can tell you, I'm not offering up my kids to find out, and I am not, I'm absolutely planning to vaccinate them as soon as we have a vaccine that we know is safe and efficacious. So,
and are the vaccine the first line of vaccines that hopefully will be available in the winter or spring? Are they going to do anything for the blood and the cardiovascular disease, or it's just the one?
Yes, we think that they will. And so currently what they're being tested for in phase 1, 2, and 3 is, so in these phase 3 trials that are going on right now, they're looking for efficacy. I'm actually going to skip ahead so I can talk to you about that right over the slide. Okay, so in terms of this question, will vaccination eradicate SARS-CoV-2? Which vaccines are leading the race? Will we still need masks after getting vaccinated? I wanted to point out that you'll find some really incredible experts on Twitter, and I keep a list of kind of people that I recommend following, but Florian Kramer has both written a really incredible review about the different vaccines that are out there, and also this kind of whole thread, this whole tutorial about the different vaccines. And in there, he very clearly describes these different types of antibody responses that we can make, whether we're focusing on IgG or this secreted IgA, and how what we know about intramuscular vaccination is that it's very good at generating this IgG that's circulating through the blood. And it's going to probably be very good at protecting you both in your lungs and the clotting disease. So also in your lungs, also in your heart, also throughout your kidney and liver and these different organs. So everything that's kind of protected through the circulation, we expect to see a lot of efficacy there. Natural infection, of course, should lead to protection both through IgA responses and secreted antibodies as well as IgG. While intranasal infection vaccination is normally thought to be very good at making this type of antibodies and not as good at making IgG. Now, in terms of not as good, we don't know if good enough. And we don't know for these second lines of vaccines that are coming out if we should kind of try a best of both. That maybe you get first that shot in the arm and then you get a spritz in the nose. So maybe we could do both, and then maybe we could really help you boost this response. What's going to get tricky is the way that we've made some of these first generation vaccines may or may not be compatible with a second boost. So that's, so as we think about the vaccines that are being tested, current phase 3 testing is going on in many different countries throughout the world, all really trying to progress this as absolute fast as possible. And I really like this graphic because this shows what the vaccine phase 3 tests are testing for. They're basically calling a number of total infections within that. So the researchers are blinded as they're running this trial. And they are saying, okay, at however many number of infections, we're going to stop the trial. And we're going to see if most of the infections were in the control group and not in the vaccinated group. In this example, this is bad because you have almost as many infected here in the vaccinated group as in the control group. And so what we're really looking to see is to see a big difference like this, where when we actually stop the trial and count who was in which group, that we see that most of the cases were in the control group and not in the vaccinated group. That's what we're hoping for. And they won't know it until they stop the phase 3. So
about the timeline of vaccination, I was curious if the speed of that process is limited by research that's specific to coronavirus, or something like logistics, or the time that it takes to get statistical significance on the population.
All of the above. So we have never had a timeline like this before. It normally takes a decade to get a vaccine tested and approved, at least. And it often takes longer than that. We have never, ever attempted something on this timeline before, that we're talking about a year time frame from start to finish in terms of getting approval, emergency use authorization. So even just the feat, at this point, Moderna has recruited 30,000 people. So they've reached the number they were planning to reach for their phase 3. In this amount of time, this is a record for, so this is such a heavily regulated field. We have so many rules and restrictions that are slowing us down at every single step of the way, both in terms of recruiting patients, getting approvals to do that, to contact them, to perform anything on them, then to test anything on them, the research on that. Every single step of the way has this tremendous regulatory burden. And normally that takes years to overcome. So the biggest things we've had to overcome in this accelerated timeline are many of the hurdles that are normally in place in terms of what would be required to recruit people, to test things, we're trying to do a lot of different things in parallel. And the other thing that we're currently very short on time for is to allow the normal 2 to 3 years post-vaccination studies to really get a good idea of safety. So normally we wouldn't make a call about safety in real time. Normally safety, so efficacy, you can kind of assess in real time. You're not really allowed to. So there's only a few moments and they have to be determined in advance. I'm actually going to go to the next slide so you can see this per slide, per these. So these are our 4 front runners right now: Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and J&J. So you can see the sample size that they're going for, and you can see the efficacy target that they're going for. So they're aiming for 50 to 60% efficacy. Now remember that the trial is healthy adults, not pregnant, haven't had a different vaccination recently, aren't going to get a different vaccination in the next 2 years. They have to commit to that, even if they're in the placebo group. I want you guys to understand that the people who have agreed to trial these different vaccines for us have taken on a huge, they have committed that they are not going to get a different vaccine in the next 2 years, and they don't know if they're getting the placebo or the real deal. So even if we have better vaccines that come online a year from now, they're actually not, they're not going to be taking those because they are, our first understanding, our first way of understanding how these vaccines work, these front runners. What I want to get across, though, is that when you have an efficacy target of 60%, that means that we're estimating real world efficacy of about 30%, because there's a lot of complicating factors out there in terms of real world vaccination that don't come into play during a trial. So into a trial, when you've pre-selected who you're gonna use in order to understand the efficacy, and you have them under very controlled conditions and under surveillance, and they're constantly, reporting any complicating factors. So this is another reason that I wanted to get across the point that the first approval of a front-runner vaccine for coronavirus, this isn't going to change our lives. This isn't going to get us back to normal. It's not.
Yeah, it's very clear from the numbers. If you're saying
30%,
that our best chance of a vaccine that might be coming in the next few months will only be effective for 30% and will not do anything for you not to be able to transmit it to other people, obviously that's just part of one of those layers of cheese.
Exactly. So that's the thing, is that 30% reduction is huge on a public health level. That's a great tool in our toolbox. But exactly, like Sarah said, it's just one layer of cheese. And that's exactly. And so, Andrew, to get at your question, I just wanted to point out this line in the graph of the number of events at completion. So this is the one thing that they're monitoring throughout. They're saying within all of these 44,000 people that we tested the vaccine on, and only 15,000 of them actually got the vaccine, right? And then you've got your placebo and your control, and then you're looking at, once they reach 164 people infected, and they each have different requirements of what they're calling infection. So that's another layer of this. Some of them are saying 1 symptom, some of them are saying 2 symptoms. I think they're all requiring some symptoms, so then it's not really an assessment of asymptomatic infection, which, as we said, they're not really trying to address, because likely these vaccines are going to still allow for asymptomatic infection. And so it's when they hit this number that they stop, that means the phase 3 is completed, and they can now go back and break everybody down into placebo and actual vaccine and say, did we have a statistical difference? Did we hit our efficacy target of 60%? This is another big point. Deep freezing required is a huge hurdle in terms of logistics. And so there's going to be a lot of improvements coming along in second generation coronavirus vaccines that are going to try to address a lot of these different things. These were our first front runners out the gate, and hopefully they're going to help us make a dent. But I think many of you should expect that, you know, there's going to be a lot of other vaccines coming along that should really help us even more really quench this. And so I guess the one other thing I really wanted to address on this front, since I really took you into IgA versus IgG, is that we see this very clearly with these animal models, where the route that we choose to vaccinate very much matters in terms of the type of immune response that we're generating. And I'm very hopeful that in some of these second generation vaccines that we're really going to try to utilize that to help us make vaccines that actually prevent transmission and prevent infection instead of just preventing disease. So in terms of thinking who's going to get these vaccines, the first people who are going to get offered this are probably, you know, our healthcare personnel, essential workers, especially those with high-risk medical conditions and adults over 65 years old. One of the problems we come into is that we know for a long time with all of our vaccinations that it's much harder to vaccinate adults that are over 65 years old. So some of the vaccine trials are specifically looking at that. But most of what's going on with our first round of vaccine trials is looking at healthy young adults. And so then there's going to be a really big decision here in terms of what that means for our elderly and how we can best protect our elderly, because normally we would use vaccination with its high efficacy in the young to prevent spread. But if we're using a vaccination type that doesn't really prevent spread, it still requires us to be very vigilant in protecting the most vulnerable. So one of the things I wanted to mention is also that some of these front-runner vaccines, you know, we may also be looking at more side effects than we're used to. And so it's another thing to take into account. I think we've gotten really spoiled with, you know, very good, safe vaccines that you know, cause very mild side effects, and maybe our arm's a little bit sore, we, you know, spike a bit of a fever, but then it comes right back down. But I think, you know, we're seeing much more than that in some of these vaccines, in the effort to really make a very strong immune response and one that's going to be very protective. We're also eliciting a little bit more side effects than we're used to. And so I also wanted to touch on what we're working on in my group. And that's that we are very focused on kind of looking into this secreted versus circulating antibodies and which vaccines are inducing what, and what does that mean in terms of protection. So you're seeing pictures of people in my team who are actively working on this, and we are trying to collect both blood and saliva from people in different vaccine trials, and then we're looking at the antibodies that are in those samples, in the blood, in the saliva, and we're comparing them and asking, okay, did you make protective antibodies in the blood? Did you make protective antibodies that you're secreting into your saliva, into your nasal cavities, that could really prevent disease? And so, of course, the bottom line here is that what we're trying to understand is, you know, which of these vaccines are really good at, you know, keeping that bandit out. And ideally, we'd like to get to the point where you don't have to double, you know, both vaccination and still wearing a mask. And as I mentioned, that there were so many, you know, deeper nuances to these antibodies that you're hearing about, this IgG, IgA, IgM. There's many more types of antibodies. The antibodies are binding to different types of proteins within the SARS virus. And each of these different types of antibodies is telling us a different piece about what kind of effector response it can elicit. And so we're really trying to look at all of that together in order to understand the immune response that we're inducing through these different types of vaccination. And so as we think about this moving forward and looking at going into Thanksgiving and the holidays and how we're going to interact with people, I think the most important thing for us to remember is that right now, the best thing that we can do is really try to keep things outdoors, or if we go indoors, to try to make those indoor environments healthy. We have to think about the ventilation in the buildings. We have to think about how we're turning over the air, or the distance that we're able to keep between each other indoors, and using masks at all times when around other people. And if we think about, what's the next most exciting things, I think that rapid, high sensitivity, testing for people who are contagious, a kind of testing that you could do on yourself every day, multiple times a day, to just try to catch that window when you're very contagious, that would do a tremendous amount towards making it safer to be with other people, and would really add a very, very important tool to our toolbox. And then, thinking beyond that, what's kind of coming soon is that we have improved therapeutics that are starting to move down the pipeline. We're getting a better understanding of this virus. We're getting a better understanding of what works, and we're starting to move those towards more testing, figuring out when is that exact right window to treat. Are we trying to treat the virus? Are we trying to treat the immune response? And getting that approved. And eventually, I hope that we do have some really great vaccines coming. And, when we understand that they really work and that they're safe, I hope that, we'll really be able to get the public to help in terms of, because you can't get public health without public engagement, and you can't get people to vaccinate without having them trust the vaccines. And I really hope that we'll be able to get to the point where we trust the vaccines enough in order to get all of you guys to trust the vaccines enough, and then really be able to use that eventually to finally bring this under control. And so if you have any other questions that you've thought about during this time, I'd love to hear them.
I have one quick question about reinfection. Do we yet understand why some people become reinfected, and why sometimes those reinfections are worse than the initial one?
Oh, absolutely. So we have started to understand more about that, and I really completely skipped over that section. I'm going to find it for you, where we have started to understand that it's rare to get reinfected, but it does happen, and it can. So in most cases, what we would hope and expect is that if you do get reinfected, it'll be almost like an asymptomatic infection, or much milder than the first one. And some of the cases of for sure reinfection, where the virus has been sequenced, and we know that it's a different virus than the virus that was there the first time, and it's definitely a clear case of reinfection. Some of them have indeed been exactly what we expected, that the second infection was much less and quicker, but we have had a few concerning examples thus far of reinfection where the reinfection was worse. And this is very worrisome, but luckily this has still been very rare. And I guess I'll show you this example, our best example to date of protection from reinfection. So just the fact that we've heard and discovered so few cases of reinfection, that's already a really good sign that probably for the vast majority of people, there really is some good protection, and we expect that that's probably the case. But this was a case where a fishing boat tried to use testing in order to prevent anybody infected from getting on the boat. but then once they were on the boat, they were going to be in these closed quarters together and not using any additional levels of prevention. And so there were 122 passengers on board. 120 of them got tested with this same test. And this test was looking for N antibodies. Now, the important thing is that our immune response very quickly recognizes that N isn't an important protein here. It's not that S key. So N, not important. S, super important. And so most people's immune responses, even though it starts out by making antibodies against N, it very quickly switches over to making antibodies against super important spike. But what happened here is they tested everybody for N antibodies, and they saw 6 people that seemed to have N antibodies. So 6 people were called positive out of the 120. And then these 114 had no antibodies. Of them, you see that most of them got infected. And so what happened was there was this, cluster event here. There was an outbreak on this fishing boat. You can see everybody's first antibody test, and then everybody's second antibody test when they returned and got tested again. And what you have here is you have 3 people who had tested positive, but they got infected, and they had tested positive for antibodies against this N antibody, N antibody against SARS-CoV-2. But what you see is that those 3, they got infected, they started making antibodies at the same rates that other people who were clearly negative at the beginning. And then you have the 3 people in purple who had tested positive for antibodies. They did not get infected, and their antibodies are still on their way down, as we talked about, because after an infection, you're on your way down to regular surveillance levels. When they retested these samples to see who had neutralizing antibodies, so who was making these really good antibodies that could block that key into the lock, that could just, like bars on the lock, what they saw is that these 3 people had neutralizing antibodies. So they were making the right type of antibodies, and they were not reinfected. And that came out highly significant. So these 3, even though they'd tested positive for N antibodies, these were these not important antibodies, and they weren't making the super duper important antibodies. So they weren't protected from infection. And that's kind of the best case we have. And then everybody was sequenced, and you can really see, other than this one outlier, everybody was in this red outbreak clade on this fishing boat. And you can see from the numbers that even though we only had 3 cases here of people who had neutralizing antibodies when they left, none of them got infected. So that was actually highly significant. And that's kind of our best evidence right now that for the most part, we are expecting that majority of people will be protected from reinfection in the short term. We don't know how long that's going to last. We know from SARS-CoV-1 that people were very much protected from reinfection that first year or 2. But then after year 2, there started to be this very sharp decline in protective antibodies. And by year 4 and year 6, there was not that much protection left. So we're not expecting that people would have a lifelong protection here. We're hoping that the vaccines will do a better job than the natural infection and making these really good antibodies stick around. But we are expecting that it might be something like the way we do flu vaccination, where we might need to retrain your immune response every year. If we're only managing to get, antibodies that only really stick around well for a year, and then they're kind of not working as well. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you guys so much for hearing this out and for all your great questions along the way. And if you think of any more questions later, just let me know.